What's up everybody, Ted Forbes here from The Art of Photography. In this video I want to take a look at this camera. This is the Panasonic Lumix GX85 or GX80 depending on where in the world you live, and I've even seen it under other names as well, so thank you Panasonic for making that ultra confusing. But this is a really interesting camera, and as most of you guys know, I have had a lot of experience in the last couple of years shooting with Sony equipment, and there's a few things that you have with Sony that are frustrating, and I've just been interested to see what else is out there. And I've read a lot of good things about this camera online. People have been raving about the image quality, the fact that it'll do 4K recording without overheating, which is a big deal. Now in this video, I'm only going to be talking about the stills functionality of the GX85. I will do a separate video talking about 4K recording because it gets kind of complicated and involved, and I kind of want to do that correctly. So I'm going to do that in a separate video. So when that video is up, I will link that up here and in the show description. So if you're interested just in the video capabilities, you can see that. But the GX85, as a stills camera, is quite excellent. In many ways, this is an alternative camera to the Panasonic G7, and they are very different form factors. The G7 is more like an SLR, it's lighter weight, it's made of plastic, but both of them are designed around the same micro four thirds 16 megapixel sensor. Now the biggest difference is the GX85 does not have the anti-aliasing filter over the sensor. Now this is kind of a standard option in various product lines with different camera manufacturers now, and the idea is that when you remove the anti-aliasing filter that you're going to get a much sharper image with more detail in it, but at the same time you do run the risk of having issues with things like moire because it may be over sharpened sometimes. But I really haven't had too much of a problem with that. And as far as form factor goes, this is very different from the G7. As far as functionality, it's very different from the G7 as well. In terms of form factor, I really like the GX85, and it's definitely not a DSLR. It's a lot smaller. It feels more to me like a small rangefinder in terms of just how it fits in your hands. There's a decent amount of weight to it, but it's not too heavy. The other thing I like is that it's not a compact. It's not going to like fit in a pocket, but it definitely is not bulky. And I carried this around for a couple days just kind of out and about shooting, and it never really felt cumbersome or anything like that. The other cool thing is the kit lens that this comes with is the 12 to 32. Now that is not the most versatile focal range in the world, but if you're shooting street photography or something like that, if you're out and about, it's really nice. The other cool thing is it has kind of a lockdown on here where it goes into a pancake mode. When you turn the camera off, you have to manually do it, but it does keep the size down a little bit and keeps it from being so bulky. In terms of layout, one of the things that I think Panasonic are really doing well is they give you plenty of custom function buttons on here. Now they're all kind of pre-mapped to certain things, but they're all customizable, and you get up to 9 if you use the touch screen as well. And so let's say you want to remap the white balance to be right under your hand a certain way, or you want to change the focus mode on the fly or something like that. You can take that custom function and map it to one of those keys, so all you have to do is hit the button and go. That's one thing that I've been a little bit frustrated with. Sony gives you a few of those on their cameras, but they don't give you a whole lot of them, and like I said, they're up to 9 on the GX85. The screen on the back does articulate somewhat. It is not fully articulating, and that is unfortunate to me because I think I'm one of those people who think that all cameras this day and age should have a fully articulating screen with a wide range of motion. But having said that though, the screen that they give you is exceptional. It is very bright, it's easy to see, even in sunlight, which is kind of unusual for a digital camera nowadays. And I think they've really done a nice job with this. It's also touch sensitive, so you can use this to navigate the menu system as well as use the autofocus functionality, and you can use touch points to actually just direct focus. The OS on here, the operating system, is very well laid out. It's easy to get through, it's easy to see. The touch functionality helps certainly with that, and I think Panasonic have this very well thought out. In terms of the autofocus system on this camera, Panasonic give you way more options than what you're ever going to need or probably use in here. They have stuff like the ability to establish touch points on a grid that are priority autofocus points. And I'll be honest with you, I think you're probably going to be sticking to the standard focus modes on here. I think they're really useful, especially when you combine those with the ability just to direct touch to autofocus on the touch sensitive screen. That really makes a lot of possibilities open up. I have noticed that if I'm in really low light on this thing, sometimes you do get a little bit of hunting and seeking when it's trying to focus in on something, but that's to be expected with most cameras in low light. The weaker point on here is probably the autofocus continuous mode, where you're actually doing focus tracking, where you're assigning a point and somebody's either moving forward or moving around. And I think that if you're shooting a lot of really fast moving subjects or you're shooting sports, this is probably not going to be the camera you're leaning towards anyway. But having said that, it's decent. It's not incredible. It will drift on you just a little bit. And of course, if you miss the perfect shot and it's drifted, that can be a problem. I think there are better autofocus systems out there. Honestly, the Sony a6300 has a really tight focus tracking to it, and any of the Canon cameras like the 70D or the 80D that use the dual pixel face detection technology are really the way to go. In terms of burst performance, I think this camera is okay. It's not incredible. When you're shooting in RAW format, the burst mode is about 8 frames a second, but once you hit about 12, 13 images, the buffer's filled up and it has to write to the card and you have to wait a second. It's not great, but Panasonic have provided a couple workarounds to this, and one of it which is called 4K photo mode, which is kind of cool. And what it does is it reduces your resolution, and of course they use the term 4K photo mode, but it is a reduced resolution. But this can be really cool for just having it buffer and fill up shots, and then later you can go in and select which ones you want. And what's really nice about that is if you're shooting something that's really fast or unpredictable, it's a great way to actually capture that action. Another mode that I really like on here that they've given us is a silent mode, and it is dead silent. Of course, it rearranges how the shutter works, and you're not going to get the speed or the burst rate or anything like that, but if you're just shooting in a real quiet situation that's really sensitive and you don't want the shutter noise going off, it can be very useful. Probably one of the most useful features, and I think kind of the highlight of this camera, for me anyway, is the 5-axis image stabilization system. So what it does is it uses 2 axes from the in-lens image stabilization, then it uses the other 3 axes from the in-body image stabilization. And this allows you to increase your shutter speed dramatically when you're hand holding. So if you're doing something like macro, or if you're shooting, one of my favorite applications is shooting in low light. And you see a lot of people shooting in low light with just this razor thin depth of field because they've got the lens wide open. Well, this allows you a little more room to stop down if you know that you can hand hold at slower shutter speeds. What's interesting is I did some tests on this, and it's really easy to shoot at as slow as 1/8 of a second. In fact, I even got that pushed up to about half a second in a couple cases, although that was not very consistent. You really do have to be in a position physically where you are stable enough to hold the camera open that long. Now, of course, this does not help you if your subject is moving. You will get motion blur from that, but as long as you're shooting something that's relatively still, this is a dramatic increase in performance in what you're able to do with shutter speeds. Now, I want to take a second and talk about dynamic range, and I'm going to show you a few examples here, because a lot of what I had read in reviews on this camera before I tried it out is that the dynamic range was pretty poor and the performance was very low. And a couple things that I discovered. Now, a lot of this has to do with what mode you're shooting in. So obviously you're going to get the best performance and the best results in the highest amount of latitude if you're shooting RAW. However, there are photographers that shoot JPEG, and of course if you're doing video, that is processed as well. Anything that requires processing, I've noticed that yes, you did get very poor performance, and highlights would blow very quickly, and there would be noise and shadows at times when you needed to bring those out a little bit in post-production. Now, if you're shooting RAW though, it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, and I'll give you an example here. This was an image that I shot last weekend. I went over to the Modern, which is a museum here in Fort Worth, contemporary art, and they have this large atrium that is mostly lit by window light. And so that this would be a perfect test for this, because this does require a wide dynamic range to be able to capture things in here. And so I made a couple modifications just in how I shot this. And what I did was it was really important to me not to blow the highlights. So basically I wanted to retain the blue sky and any texture that was back there. So I actually underexposed this just a little bit, 2/3 of a stop actually. And so the whole idea was that I was just going to bring out the shadows later. Now, one thing you need to know about digital photography is that in terms of highlights, when they go white, when they go to pure white, you can't get them back. You're going to lose all your details. So highlights are important. Shadows you can usually recover a little bit more with, but that's where a lot of the noise hides. And so that's what I wanted to see. So there's several different ways you can do this, but as shot, what I did in post was I went ahead and I brought the exposure up just a little bit, so it brought a little the shadows up, and then what I did is I brought the highlights back down because I knew there was information there to work with, and the end result is actually, for the most part, pretty usable. It's not the greatest dynamic range in the world. In fact, I think there are other options out there that probably will give you a much better dynamic range. But one thing I want you to consider, and this is what I want to talk about kind of to wrap this up, is when you consider the price point of the GX85. Right now in the US, you can get this for just under $800, and that includes the kit lens. I think in terms of what you're getting on this camera, you get an enormous amount of bang for your buck. Yeah, you can do better, but not in this price range, I don't think. And so I think that's one of the things that's interesting to me. Now, I do have a few minor complaints about the GX85, and none of them are real deal breakers, but I think they're worth mentioning. One thing from me, and I noticed just in general in shooting, is when I was using automatic white balance, is that the camera, and I don't know if it's just this model that I have, it was kind of all over the place. And that's not a big deal when you're shooting raw because you can go back and fix the white balance without losing anything. But it's another step in post, and if you're shooting video, it does become problematic because it's harder to correct that in video, obviously, because it's a processed signal that you're working with in at that point. And so that was one little minor complaint I had, was white balance. The other one for me is the electronic viewfinder. And the problem is that it's actually well designed, it's a good resolution, and it looks okay. It's just too small. And it reminded me of when, you know, everybody started shooting digital, and I had my first Canon Rebel and then later my D40. And I was used to these high magnification viewfinders in 35mm SLRs, and moving down to these small little digital screens, it was something that just, it was hard to use. And I kind of feel the same way about this. The other thing that's very frustrating to me is if you have this set up and you're using the screen to kind of touch your autofocus points and use the touch functionality to select them, and then all of a sudden you hold it up to your eye, like if your nose hits that, you just selected another autofocus point. You got to go back out and cancel, and then you've missed something. And so that was one minor gripe. And so I kind of question as to whether or not this camera even needs the EVF on there. I certainly didn't find myself using it very much because it was just kind of either frustrating to use or not very practical, or like I said, my nose would hit a focus point and anyway, game over there. So it was just a little odd to me. But anyway, those are minor gripes. And aside from that, I think as a stills camera, I think this is an incredible bang for your buck. If you're looking to get into a micro Four Thirds system, this is an excellent starting point. I think that if you have a bigger budget for a camera, but you still want something that maybe you have for carry around for travel or for street photography, something like that, I think the Lumix GX85 is certainly perfect for those things. Now, video I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about that in a separate video because there's a lot to it and there's a lot I want to talk about. So I will release that tomorrow, and if you're watching this in the future and it's already out, please check the show description and I will have that link up there once I have the second video up. But anyway, that has been my review of the Panasonic Lumix GX85. If you guys enjoyed this video, please remember to like it, share it, subscribe to The Art of Photography so you'll always be up to date on all the stuff that I put out. And until the next video, I'll see you guys then. Later.